Welcome to Feature Fridays. My name is Guy Bartram. I'm Director of Product Marketing in our Cloud Provider Business Unit at VMware. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Antione Larpin. Antione, welcome. Can you please give everyone an introduction on who you are and what you do?
Thank you, Guy. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you for having me. My name is Antoine. I'm based in Brussels, and I'm in charge of EU policy for VMware. It's an exciting job where we are at the crossroad between politics, policy, and business.
Thank you, Antoine. So you sit in Brussels. That's fantastic. So this is the heart of the EU kind of political engine and political power. So we're here today to talk about sovereignty and the importance of sovereignty to our customers, our partners, and supply chain in general. But who is driving the sovereignty conversation, and what are they trying to achieve?
Great, big question, Guy. Well, in these many years in Brussels, I've seen the emergence of the sovereignty conversation on the back of the changing geopolitical landscape. Take just the last year, as you think about the Trump presidency, the rise of China. This has pushed the European Union to rethink its place in the world, and ascertain its place in the world has been defined as a key policy objective of this Commission. If you think about the first press conference of the new European Commission president back in 2019, she stated that she wanted this new European Commission to be geopolitical, or it will fail. This was quite a big statement in 2019. Think in the meantime what happened. The COVID crisis, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, all of this has confirmed the idea in Europe that Europe needs to be more independent and more in control of its own resources. So this has been a key driver of the sovereignty conversation. And this is not over. This will continue. Think about the tensions, China, Taiwan. So Europe is really leading this conversation, and we are at the forefront of these developments.
Yeah, there's a lot of concerns and a lot of geopolitical pressure that is molding this conversation. So how would you describe the sovereignty conversation in Brussels and in Europe in general?
Well, I think the first point to make is that it's everywhere. The sovereignty conversation is omnipresent in the policy conversations. You hear about sovereignty, of course, in the context of technology, which is what we're interested in today. But of course, you hear about that for healthcare. Think about access to medicines, which has been a big challenge at the start of the pandemic. We hear a lot about sovereignty for energy, of course. But it's also about food sovereignty. It's also about cultural sovereignty, even. There are conversations about European films representation in the catalogs of video-on-demand online platforms. This is about sovereignty as well, the place of European content. So that's the first point. It's omnipresent. The second point, I would say, is that there is no commonly accepted definition of sovereignty. So in the European Union, the need for sovereignty has particularly been expressed, I would say, as an answer to the vulnerabilities that can arise from overdependencies in a global economy. So for example, very recently, the Internal Market Commissioner, Mr. Thierry Breton, was stating and commenting on the weaknesses observed in the area of energy and how it can be weaponized by foreign nations. And that's the context of the war in Ukraine, of course. So this was also the same thinking is being applied about these, vulnerabilities that can be utilized and by foreign or third countries. And you can think about, access to semiconductors and many other technologies.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say the sleeping giant has awoken to kind of realize that these dependencies on supply chains where there are a singular approach to getting a source like energy with such a wide scope in the market, it's really important to have more choice and flexibility around your supply chain and your suppliers, and also just to be in ownership of that yourself. And ownership relates to a lot of the principles around sovereignty. It's about things like data sovereignty, for example, owning and managing and being responsible for that data. So how would you describe sovereignty in relation to technology and the digital sphere?
Look, I would say, first of all, that the concept of sovereignty is prevalent in the digital sphere. You see many dimensions and many technologies that are concerned by this concept. We talked about semiconductors and chips. Think about 5G, artificial intelligence, cryptography. So that's probably the first thing. It's really, it has further dimensions. The other bit of that is that as we see the data, the value of the data is gaining more and more importance as a strategic asset. And this is where we can also talk about data sovereignty as being able to act in a self-determined manner in the digital space. And to do that, it requires transparency, choice, and control of your own data.
Yeah, and data is not standing still. This is, the part of the issue is that data is growing at 20 to 30% annually, and solutions and technologies like machine learning and AI are driving far more data into environments than we've ever seen before, as well as obviously the continual growth of media and personal data as well, all compacting that requirement to have a data sovereignty in place and a strategy around data sovereignty. So, Antoine, how would you explain the approach that European countries are taking to the issue of digital sovereignty?
First, there is a big realization across EU countries and beyond, in fact, about the importance of the data, like you said, protecting the data, bringing transparency, choice, and control. So what you see is probably a dispersed reaction. Every country is taking its own approach and starting its own initiatives. And perhaps I can give you some more concrete examples that we see within the European Union. I would start with France, probably quite at the forefront of this conversation. And France has recently introduced a cybersecurity certification scheme called SecNum Cloud, which contains some sovereignty requirements. For instance, with respect to the localization of the data of the service provider. And we see, for instance, in the Netherlands, also the new cloud strategy by the government mentioning multi-cloud as a preferred option to tackle and mitigate the several risks that can be associated with the data. Italy, very important as well, is also leading with some new sovereignty conversations. We see some sovereignty elements in the Italian cloud strategy and its guidelines for the implementation of the so-called national G-cloud infrastructure. The Italian National Cybersecurity Agency is also quite at the forefront. It has developed some a classification matrix, if I can say, about data by sensitivity of the data and services. And this is to guide the migration of data to qualified government cloud as to meet the required level of protections according to the sensitivity of the data. And maybe final example or thinking is what Germany is doing. not only very important member states of the EU, but also Germany has been at the forefront of the digital sovereignty conversations since years. The current situation with the war in Ukraine is probably leaving many people facing or realizing that there's some unequal dependencies in the digital world, but also in other areas like energy, that we can all read about these days.
Yeah.
At the same time, Germany is one of the largest exporting economy in the world. And there is a very strong interest in Germany to keep open markets. So as a result, Germany is moving very cautiously on the conversation on sovereignty as to strike the right balance and as to avoid, in fact, that sovereignty means protectionism. You see that very well, actually, in the coalition agreements, which refers to a multi-cloud strategy for the public sector. And this was also confirmed in a more recent digital strategy of the German government released on the 31st of August this year. So similar to Germany, some other countries in Europe are also concerned that the sovereignty conversation may lead to protectionism.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Europe is, politically one body, but from a national country level, what you're saying is we're seeing different countries implement different interpretations of sovereignty and data sovereignty and digital sovereignty. So the EU body must be quite concerned about this then, and particularly around the fact that there could be a rise in this protectionism to the point where it would become difficult for the EU to actually then mandate or pass policy that would apply to all of the EU. So how does this translate at the EU level? What are the sovereignty requirements that the EU is defining?
That's a great comment, Guy. I think there is no simple answer. We would love to say, you just follow these guidelines Italy has developed on classification of data and you can apply it across the piece. That would be very helpful, I believe, for legal certainty and smoothen the business operations across the EU. But there isn't such thing as you said. It's a complex architecture from a legislative point of view, with EU countries moving their own way, European level as well, adding or developing requirements on top. So I think the trend at the moment is more and more initiatives that are being developed. Perhaps in the future, what we will see is actually these requirements going to the same direction, being aggregated around most likely what the EU level will develop. So that's why we need to pay a lot of attention as to what the European Commission in particular is working on, which requirements are being developed to address the risks relating to privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property, competition, I would say, / market concentration that we sometimes see in the cloud environments. So you ask maybe about specific initiatives. I'll give you maybe 2 or 3 examples. I'll start with maybe a very specific sectorial legislation that covers financial services institutions under the fancy name of DORA, which stands for Digital Operational Resilience Act. There's been a new set of rules that financial institutions need to follow as to mitigate the risks from the market concentration of their cloud operations. And that's a very interesting piece. And I may come back to some aspects of that later. The same spirit, the Data Act is a piece of legislation under legislative adoption. So we're not quite yet there, but the ambition is to facilitate switching between cloud services and cloud providers, building on open standards and open specifications and open APIs, which is a good thing. And though it is maybe a little bit prescriptive as to mandates that the technology should deliver on this interoperability and portability, it is giving an option for cloud customers to have more choice and control about where they put their workloads according to sensitivity of the data. So we think this is very much landing well with the spirit of this multi-cloud environment we operate in. And maybe the final example as well, very concrete, relating to cybersecurity requirements that are being developed at the moment by the ENISA, the EU Cybersecurity Agency. The requirements will come from certification schemes. And from what we've seen, and again, it is under adoption, we foresee requirements around company ownership, who owns the entity that wants to be certified, international transfers of data, as well as staff empowerments, accreditation, and support permission. So there's a variety of initiatives, as you can see.
Yeah, and it's a very complex environment when you consider each one of these initiatives. Some of them are in law now, and others are evolving. And also, you mentioned a couple of things I want to drill into. So data transfer outside of a sovereign entity is a very, very tricky thing to manage. Who has jurisdictional control over your data, and who has the ability to legally look at that data and obtain that data? It's a very confusing picture when you look at all of these different laws and acts that are being passed as to where you would stand by outsourcing your data to a cloud provider. Equally, I think the other kind of thing to highlight is you mentioned choice and choice to kind of move your data out of one cloud to another depending on its classification. Those are, real sovereign cloud requirements, aren't they? You need to have that choice of platform. You need to have that ability to ensure your data is protected from foreign jurisdictional controls. And a lot of that can really affect how a business looks at making a cloud choice. And you mentioned DORA, so can you give a little bit more light on, DORA is designed to minimize risk, you said, in the financial sector and provide resilience. How is that being, how is that program being interpreted by the financial sector?
Great point, Guy. Yeah, I think you're right. That's why I think it's interesting, because it's probably one of these first pieces of legislation that has landed and is giving a direction about how businesses and even public institutions can be required to operate in a risky cloud environment, if I can say. I think that probably the one aspect of DORA I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on is about what DORA foresees to mitigate the risks from market concentration. And to keep it simple, I think DORA it's very much about requiring operators to think about their plan B, to think about an exit strategy. What if your current provider fails? What's happening? I would explain maybe simple terms, don't put all your eggs in the same basket.
Yeah.
And that is really, it's almost like good policy and good governance for your data, in fact, as to think about this plan B and anticipate with your IT departments what an exit strategy can and should be, as to make your operations more resilient.
Yeah, and you raise a really great point. 5-10 years ago, when cloud first started gaining momentum, lots of large companies made big bets with large cloud providers, public cloud providers. almost all of their eggs were in one basket because commercially it made a lot of sense. And now that is being re-examined, particularly in Europe, and a lot of workloads are being repatriated into sovereign clouds in their sovereign nation, purely so they then have that exit strategy, they have that choice then to be able to manage their resilience within the national boundary, to ensure their jurisdiction is not circumvented. So with these challenges and evolving legislation, how would you say businesses and indeed nation states should operate with sovereignty in mind?
I think what we're seeing is that the conversation matures and the requirements for sovereignty are being defined as we speak and adopted as well. So what we see is that businesses are increasingly confronted with considerations of technical, legal, or commercial nature as to mitigate the risks that are associated with going to the cloud. And in parallel as well, I think that's probably a trend that we're starting to see, and it will last for sure, is that public procurements is referring increasingly to sovereignty requirements. So businesses need to be prepared for that, understand where the trend is going. And I would say also realize it is not only about compliance with the requirements. It is also about how you go to market and with which partners, as to identify which technology solutions, technology mix will best address your customers' requirements. So again, this will continue to develop in Europe, but also beyond Europe. That's maybe what we call the Brussels effect at EU level, which means European standards can become global standards. You've heard about GDPR. Everyone has heard about GDPR, even in Japan, far away from Europe. And what we think is, and what we see is that the private and public sector in this context should very much think and embrace cloud solutions that provide the openness, the interoperability, the portability, and the reversibility, as well, you mentioned, of cloud services. With these features, you're probably well equipped to deal with these sovereignty requirements that are coming.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point. It's not just the business itself considering its need for sovereignty, which is a must now, not just for large businesses, but also for small businesses, because as a part of a supply chain, you need to be knowledgeable about things like data exchange and understanding what data you are sharing and sharing securely and how that data gets shared. So I think this trend will ripple through the entire cloud market in Europe, in APJ, very strongly. And we're seeing our hyperscale public cloud providers now paying attention and looking at how they can create their own trusted cloud solutions to fit into a sovereign strategy. And you mentioned vendors, choosing the right vendor to kind of be on that journey with you. I think this is really important. VMware was probably one of the first to market from a vendor perspective to recognize the requirements around sovereign cloud and set up our sovereign cloud initiative for our cloud partners. And I think, when we look at VMware Explore, our event in the USA and soon in Barcelona, our CEO, put it very succinctly around the position in cloud and making those cloud smart decisions. So do you just want to kind of look at it a little bit more from the political angle, and what's VMware's answer to the the political demand of data sovereignty?
I believe VMware has a very strong value proposition to enable cloud sovereignty. And that is by offering this choice and control over your cloud capabilities, our customers' cloud capabilities. So you talked about the excitement 10 years ago to go to the cloud, and that was maybe, the cloud first idea, move to the cloud. And that's where hyperscalers have been so successful, because they were able, and they are able today, to develop fantastic solutions for their customers, unbeatable solutions by the scale, by the, how the solutions can be tailored as well. So this is really fantastic. At the same time, what we see today is the need to move from this cloud-first approach to the cloud-smart approach. And that's what we talked about earlier, about the customers being equipped with the right tools and flexibility to choose the best cloud scenario according to their needs. So what does that mean in terms of data criticality? It's difficult word for me. What about workload efficiency, performance, security, and increasingly sustainability, of course, as well. So, customers can make these assessments, and this will allow for several cloud offerings to be interoperable. This is the multi-cloud offering by VMware. You make different cloud offerings interoperable with each other, and then you, this way, avoid one-sided dependencies. So this is very strong value proposition, I believe, from political point of view, answering the political demand, but of course the customer's demand, as I described. So I would say, the emergence of these sovereignty requirements are really asking the question about immunity of the data for the third country jurisdiction. And this is a fundamental question customers are asking themselves, and also are, turning to their cloud providers for answers as well. So this is becoming more and more critical, in fact, that customers adopt this multi-cloud approach and identify where their highly sensitive data sets are, and how the sovereignty requirements are placing this, where is the best place to place these sensitive data sets in a specialized sovereign cloud environment, or for less critical data in another environment.
I think you mentioned a number of good things there. So ESG, as it's known pretty much globally, but I think it's mostly an American term, environment, social, and governance. From an environment perspective, we're seeing the same thing ripple through the supply chain. Concern about carbon neutrality, reaching a net zero carbon goal by 2030, which we have in our Zero Carbon Committed Partner Program. And we're seeing now more and more customers have this part of their RFP dedicated to sustainability and renewable energy, as well as, interestingly, and I think this all comes under the sovereignty banner as well, the social values. Sovereign clouds are there to protect sovereign data and encourage the growth of the national interest, utilizing data as an economy. And running those clouds with social values in place means that you're giving back to the nation, you're prospering that nation, and you're helping that nation grow, whether it's getting technical people trained, giving back to the community, using only national employees. Those are all kind of key things in the social. And then, of course, from the governance perspective, to wrap this kind of conversation up, it's all about the data classification. It's about the understanding where your data is, the legal aspect of who has control over your data, the jurisdictional control legally over your data. And, at the moment, I feel the EU is doing a great job on leading the charge, just like we did with GDPR. I mean, that was really groundbreaking as an initiative to come out of the EU, and like you say, adopted in many different geos around the world, and has really woken up other geos to the importance of data privacy. That kind of classification of data and understanding what that data is and how it can be used, a lot of companies struggle with that. And I think that's where, cloud providers can come in, specialist organizations who do things like data classification assessments and continual compliance management on those. It's all about choosing the right partner, but also the right vendor and ecosystem of vendors who are sovereign by nature, not necessarily SaaS solutions that run in out of jurisdiction environments. Not saying those can't be used, they can be, but only in a trusted manner, not for classified data. So all of these things, I think, ultimately, from my perspective, VMware, like you said, making that cloud smart decision, our ecosystem of partners and our technology are two real facilitators to start the data sovereignty process running and help organizations achieve their sovereignty goals. So Antoine, just to finish up, any kind of final thoughts, or did I wrap it up?
You stole my word, Guy. It's a fantastic wrap up. I don't have anything to say, so I'd probably paraphrase what you say, but just to wrap it up, indeed, say that indeed governments are driving the sovereignty discussion. Europe is leading and will continue to inspire other regions in this field. We're seeing it today, it will last, and it will continue and expand to more and more countries thinking about that. And yes, and VMware in all of this is a great enabler. The multi-cloud strategy of VMware and solutions offered by VMware are really answering a lot of the demands, political demands, concrete business demands from our customers, with in search of concrete solutions. So this is exciting times, I would say.
Absolutely. I look forward to a rosy sovereign future. Antoine, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Guy, for having me.